The stagecoach lurched to a halt outside the Mercantile in Centralia, Washington, and Sophia Dawson tumbled out more than stepped, her worn boots catching on the hem of her threadbare dress as three women on the boardwalk leaned together like crows on a wire, their voices sharp enough to cut through the autumn air of 1876. "Lord have mercy, look at that poor creature," one of them whispered, though not quietly enough. "She's far too skinny, sickly. You can see her bones through that dress." Sophia felt her cheeks burn despite the chill wind coming down from the mountains. She had heard variations of those words her entire life, especially in the past year since her aunt had died and left her with nothing but debts and a one-way ticket west to work as a seamstress for a distant cousin she'd never met. The journey from Ohio had taken 3 weeks, and she'd eaten sparingly to make her meager funds last. Now, standing in this timber town with mountains looming on all sides and the smell of fresh-cut lumber thick in the air, she felt every bit as frail and unwanted as those women's clucking suggested. "Miss Dawson," a reedy voice called from the Mercantile doorway. A thin man with spectacles and a permanently worried expression emerged. "I'm Howard Whitley. I was supposed to meet my cousin, but there seems to have been a misunderstanding." Sophia's stomach dropped. She clutched her single carpet bag tighter. "A misunderstanding? My wife wrote to your aunt about the seamstress position, but that was before we knew about the baby. Martha's taken ill with the pregnancy, and we simply cannot afford another person in the household now. I'm terribly sorry." He wouldn't meet her eyes, shuffling his feet on the wooden planks. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Sophia reached for the post supporting the Mercantile awning, her vision swimming. "But I have nowhere else to go. There's a boarding house on 3rd Street, though I hear Mrs. Patterson charges steep rates." Howard Whitley was already backing toward his shop door, clearly eager to escape this uncomfortable situation. "I truly am sorry, Miss Dawson. Times are hard for everyone." The door closed with a definitive click, and Sophia stood alone on the boardwalk as the three women continued their observation from across the muddy street. She had exactly $4.37 to her name, and from the looks of this rough timber town, that would last perhaps a week if she was lucky and ate next to nothing. "You looking for work?" A gravelly voice startled her. An older woman with steel-gray hair and a face like weathered leather had appeared beside her, carrying a basket of vegetables. "I'm Agnes Harper. I run the kitchen at the logging camp about 5 miles north of here. One of my helpers just ran off with a timber cruiser, and I need someone who can peel potatoes and wash dishes. Pays not much, but you get 3 meals a day and a cot in the kitchen house." 3 meals a day. The words rang in Sophia's ears like church bells. "Yes," she said, perhaps too quickly. "Yes, I can do that." Agnes looked her up and down with a critical eye that reminded Sophia of a horse trader evaluating stock. "You're thin as a rail, girl. Can you handle hard work?" "I'm stronger than I look," Sophia lied, standing as straight as her tired body would allow. "I've been working since I was 12. "Well, you'll get your strength back if you stick with me. I feed my workers proper. Come on then, wagons this way." Agnes jerked her head toward a sturdy freight wagon hitched to 2 massive draft horses. "We've got 43 loggers to feed tonight, and I'm already behind schedule." The ride north took them through dense forests of Douglas fir and cedar, so tall they seemed to scrape the gray October sky. Agnes kept up a running commentary about the logging operation, the men who worked it, and the challenges of feeding hungry workers in the wilderness. Sophia tried to listen, but exhaustion was creeping through her bones, and the rocking of the wagon made her eyelids heavy. "That's the camp," Agnes said finally, and Sophia forced herself alert. The logging camp sprawled across a cleared area beside a rushing river, a collection of rough buildings dominated by a long bunkhouse, several equipment sheds, and what was clearly the mess hall and kitchen house. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, and the sound of axes and saws echoed through the valley. Men moved like ants across the cleared areas, hauling logs, working teams of oxen, shouting to each other in voices that carried across the distance. "Kitchen's there," Agnes pointed to a building attached to the mess hall. "You'll sleep in the back room. There's another girl, Mary, who helps with the cooking. She's 16 and not the brightest candle in the chandelier, but she's got a good heart. Now come on, we've got work to do." The next hours passed in a blur of activity. Sophia's hands moved automatically, peeling endless potatoes, washing pots larger than anything she'd ever handled, setting out tin plates and cups for the evening meal. Her arms ached, her feet throbbed, and twice she had to steady herself against the work table when dizziness washed over her. "You need to eat something," Mary said, a plump girl with rosy cheeks and concerned eyes. She pushed a bowl of stew toward Sophia. "Agnes will tan my hide if you faint into the potato bin." The stew was thick with venison, potatoes, carrots, and onions, seasoned with herbs that made Sophia's mouth water. She ate slowly, forcing herself not to gulp despite her hunger, and felt warmth spread through her chest for the first time in days. It was the best thing she'd tasted in months, possibly years. Better," Agnes grunted approvingly, passing by with an armload of bread loaves. "You'll have another bowl after the men are fed. Can't have you collapsing in my kitchen." The loggers began filing in at sunset, a steady stream of men in worn work clothes, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their hands calloused and scarred from hard labor. They were loud and boisterous, joking with each other, their appetites enormous. Sophia stayed in the kitchen, helping load serving platters and wash dishes as they came back, trying not to think about the sheer size and roughness of these men. She was elbow-deep in dishwater when she heard Agnes's voice rise above the general din. "Jonas, get yourself in here, you stubborn ox." "I'll eat later, Agnes. Got to finish repairs on the flume before dark." The voice that answered was deep, resonant, and carried an edge of exhaustion that Sophia recognized all too well. "You'll eat now before you fall off that fool contraption and break your neck. I mean it, Jonas Jameson." Heavy footsteps approached the kitchen, and Sophia glanced over her shoulder reflexively. The man who filled the doorway was unlike anyone she'd ever seen. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly touched both sides of the frame. His arms, bare beneath rolled-up sleeves, were corded with muscle built from years of hard labor, and his chest strained against his worn flannel shirt. Dark hair fell past his collar, tied back with a leather cord, and several days of beard shadowed a jaw that looked carved from granite. But it was his eyes that caught her, steel gray and exhausted, with lines of weariness etched around them that suggested he'd been working far too long without rest. He stopped when he saw her, those gray eyes meeting hers for a long moment, and Sophia felt something shift in her chest, a sensation like recognition, though they'd never met. "New helper," Agnes said shortly, breaking the moment. "Sophia Dawson, this is Jonas Jameson. He runs this operation, and he's a damned fool who works himself into the ground and forgets to eat." "Madam," Jonas said, nodding to Sophia. His voice was rough but not unkind. "To Agnes," he said, "I'll take something with me. Don't have time to sit. You'll sit for 10 minutes or I'll brain you with my skillet." Agnes planted her fists on her hips. "I've known you since you were in short pants, Jonas Jameson, and I won't watch you work yourself to death because you think you have to prove something to those investors in Seattle." Something flickered across Jonas's face, too quick for Sophia to identify, but he sighed and pulled out a chair at the kitchen work table. 10 minutes. Agnes ladled an enormous portion of stew into a bowl and set it in front of him along with half a loaf of bread. "Eat. All of it." Sophia turned back to her dishes, acutely aware of the massive man sitting just feet behind her. She could hear him eating, the clink of his spoon against the bowl, and she wondered what kind of man inspired such fierce concern from the practical Agnes. "You just arrived in Centralia?" Jonas asked after a moment, and Sophia realized he was speaking to her. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron. "This morning. From Ohio." He studied her with those penetrating gray eyes, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he was seeing more than she wanted to show. "Long journey." "Yes." She didn't elaborate, didn't mention the failed job prospect or her near-destitute state. Some things were too raw to speak aloud. "She was standing outside Whitley's Mercantile looking like a strong wind would blow her over," Agnes interjected, not looking up from the pie dough she was rolling. "That weasel Howard had promised her cousin work and then backed out, left the poor girl stranded." "Whitley's always been weak-spined," Jonas said, anger sharpening his tone. He returned his attention to Sophia. "You'll be safe here. The men know I don't tolerate any disrespect toward the kitchen staff. Anyone bothers you, you tell Agnes or Mary and I'll handle it." There was steel in his voice, a promise of protection that made something in Sophia's chest tighten. She'd been taking care of herself for so long, the idea of someone standing between her and trouble felt almost foreign. "Thank you," she managed. Jonas finished his meal in silence, then stood, the chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Thank you, Agnes. It was good." "It's always good," Agnes retorted. "Now get some sleep instead of working all night." "Can't. Flume's partially collapsed and we need it operational by morning or we'll lose a day's production." He settled a battered hat on his head and nodded again to Sophia. "Welcome to camp, Miss Dawson." Then he was gone, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor, and Sophia released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "That man," Agnes muttered, shaking her head, "works harder than any 3 men combined. Took over this operation when his father died 2 years back, and he's been trying to prove he can run it ever since. The investors from Seattle are breathing down his neck, and if he doesn't meet production quotas, they'll replace him with some city man who doesn't know a Douglas fir from a dinner fork." "That's terrible," Sophia said softly, understanding something about fighting to prove your worth. "It's the way of things," Agnes said with a shrug. "Now, you finish those dishes and then get yourself to bed. Tomorrow starts before dawn around here." The back room was small but clean, with 2 narrow cots, a washstand, and hooks on the wall for clothes. Mary was already asleep in one bed, snoring softly, and Sophia sank onto the other with a gratitude that went bone deep. The cot was hardly comfortable, but it was more than she'd had any right to expect this morning, and she offered a silent prayer of thanks before exhaustion pulled her under. She woke to darkness and the sound of Agnes moving in the kitchen, building up the fire, starting the day's cooking. Sophia dressed quickly in the same worn dress, splashed cold water on her face, and joined the older woman. "Good, you're up," Agnes said. "Start the coffee. The men will be wanting breakfast in an hour, and we've got flapjacks, bacon, and oatmeal to prepare." The days that followed developed a rhythm. Sophia rose before dawn, worked through breakfast service, cleaned, prepared the midday meal that Mary and another worker would take out to the men in the forest, then started on dinner. The work was endless and exhausting, but for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sophia ate regularly. Agnes was true to her word about feeding her workers, and she watched Sophia like a hawk, making sure she had generous portions at every meal. "You need meat on your bones," Agnes would say, adding an extra piece of fried chicken to Sophia's plate or ladling more stew into her bowl. "Can't have you wasting away in my kitchen," Sophia protested at first, uncomfortable with taking more than her share, but Agnes was immovable, and gradually Sophia stopped fighting it. The constant ache of hunger that had been her companion for months began to fade. She could feel herself growing stronger, her arms developing lean muscle from the heavy pots and water buckets, her stamina increasing as proper nutrition fueled her body. Jonas appeared in the kitchen occasionally, usually late in the evening when the other men had finished eating. He was always exhausted, dirt and sawdust coating his clothes, sometimes a fresh cut or bruise marking his hands or face. Agnes would feed him and scold him in equal measure, and he would accept both with patient grace. Sophia found herself watching for him, listening for his heavy footsteps, though she told herself it was simple curiosity about the man who ran this operation. He was unfailingly polite to her, nodding his greetings, occasionally asking how she was settling in, but he never lingered. There was always another emergency, another crisis that demanded his attention. "That Flume's going to kill him," Agnes muttered one evening after Jonas had left with barely enough time to finish his meal. "He's been working on it for 3 days straight, barely sleeping." "Can't someone else do it?" Sophia asked, stacking clean plates on the shelf. "He doesn't trust anyone else to do it right, and maybe he's got reason. That Flume controls the water that runs the sawmill and helps move logs down the mountain. If it fails completely, the whole operation stops." Agnes wiped her hands on her apron. "He's carrying the weight of every man in this camp on his shoulders, all their families, all their livelihoods. It's too much for one person. But try telling him that." 2 weeks into Sophia's time at the camp, disaster struck. She was preparing lunch when they heard shouting from the direction of the Flume, men's voices raised in alarm. Agnes and Sophia rushed to the door in time to see several loggers running toward the waterworks, and moments later, someone burst into the mess hall. "Jonas fell! The Flume gave way, and he fell into the ravine." Sophia's heart stopped. The ravine was a rocky gorge with a 50-foot drop where the Flume carried water across a gap in the mountainside. She'd seen it from a distance, had shuddered at the height and the danger. Agnes had already grabbed her medical kit, the one she kept for treating the inevitable cuts and injuries that came with logging work. "How bad?" "Don't know yet. They're pulling him up now." Sophia followed Agnes without thinking, her feet carrying her toward the crowd of men gathered at the ravine's edge. They had ropes down, and as she watched, they hauled up a makeshift stretcher with Jonas's large frame strapped to it. Even from a distance, she could see blood on his face, his shirt torn, one leg bent at an unnatural angle. They carried him to the camp office, a small building with a desk and a cot in the corner. Agnes took charge immediately, barking orders at the men to bring hot water and clean cloth. Sophia found herself at Agnes's side without consciously deciding to be there, her hands steady as she helped cut away Jonas's torn shirt, revealing bruises already darkening across his ribs and a deep gash on his shoulder. "Leg's broken," Agnes said grimly, examining the limb with practiced hands. "Clean break at least. These ribs are probably cracked but not broken through. That shoulder needs stitching." Jonas regained consciousness as Agnes was setting the leg, his face going white, sweat beading on his forehead. He bit back a groan, his jaw clenching so hard Sophia thought his teeth might crack. "Easy," Agnes said, not unkindly. "Worst part's almost done." "Camp," Jonas forced out through gritted teeth. "Someone needs to supervise the cutting crew, and the flume needs proper repair, not just patching." "The camp will survive a few days without you hovering over every detail," Agnes said sharply, wrapping his leg in splints. "Thomas can supervise the cutting, and we'll hire someone from town to do the flume repairs. You're staying in this bed until that leg starts healing, and I don't want to hear any argument." "Agnes," Jonas started, but the older woman cut him off. "No, you're no good to anyone if you kill yourself, Jonas Jameson. Now hold still while I stitch this shoulder." Sophia found herself holding Jonas's hand as Agnes worked the needle, though she couldn't remember reaching for him. His grip was strong despite his injuries, his palm calloused and rough against hers. His gray eyes met hers once, holding her gaze for a long moment, and something unspoken passed between them, a connection that made Sophia's breath catch. When Agnes finally finished, Jonas had passed out again, exhaustion and pain pulling him under. Agnes stood, wiping her hands. "He'll need watching through the night. That knock to his head worries me. Someone should stay with him, make sure he wakes up regular." "I'll do it," Sophia heard herself say. Agnes looked at her sharply, then nodded. "Mary can handle breakfast prep with me. You stay here and you wake me if there's any change for the worse." The office fell quiet as the men dispersed, returning to work with worried glances back at the building. Sophia pulled a chair close to the cot and settled in for a long night. She'd tended her aunt through the final illness, knew something about caring for the sick and injured, though nothing as dramatic as this. Jonas woke every few hours, disoriented at first, then focusing on her face with those intense gray eyes. She gave him water, checked his bandages as Agnes had shown her, spoke to him in low, soothing tones until he drifted back to sleep. Sometimes he mumbled about work, about production quotas and investors, and she shushed him gently, reminding him that everything could wait until he was healed. Toward dawn, he woke more clearly than before and found her still sitting beside him, keeping watch. "You should rest," he said, his voice rough with disuse. "I'm fine," Sophia replied softly. "How do you feel?" "Like I fell off a mountain." A hint of humor touched his eyes. "Which I suppose I did." "You scared everyone." The words came out more intense than she intended. "You scared me." Something shifted in his expression, surprise and something else, something warmer. "I'm sorry." They looked at each other in the gray light of early morning, and Sophia felt that connection again, stronger this time, a recognition that went deeper than words. This man, this strong, stubborn, self-sacrificing man, had somehow become important to her in the space of 2 weeks, and the depth of her concern for him was startling. "Jonas," she started, not sure what she meant to say, but Agnes's arrival interrupted the moment. "Good, you're awake," the older woman said briskly, setting down a tray with broth and bread. "And you're going to eat every bit of this and then rest. Sophia, go get some sleep. You've been up all night." The next days established a new pattern. Agnes and Mary handled most of the kitchen work, and Sophia found herself assigned as Jonas's primary caretaker. She brought him meals, changed his bandages, helped him sit up despite his protests, and sat with him during the long afternoon hours when the camp grew quiet. They talked during those hours, tentative at first, then with growing ease. Jonas told her about growing up in the timber camps, about learning the business from his father, about his dreams of running the operation his own way, treating the workers fairly while still meeting the demands of the investors. Sophia spoke about Ohio, about her parents who died when she was young, about her aunt's genteel poverty and the desperate years after her death. "You've had it rough," Jonas said quietly one afternoon, watching her face as she described pawning her mother's few pieces of jewelry to pay for food. "Everyone has their struggles," Sophia replied, uncomfortable with his sympathy. "Mine aren't special. That doesn't make them less real." His hand found hers on the blanket, his large fingers wrapping around her smaller ones. "You're strong, Sophia, stronger than you know." She looked down at their joined hands, feeling warmth spread through her chest. "You're one to talk. You're carrying this entire camp on your shoulders." "Maybe we could both learn to let others help carry the weight," he said, and she looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. After that, something changed between them. The connection that had been building since that first meeting in the kitchen deepened into something neither could ignore. Jonas's eyes would follow her when she moved around the room, and Sophia found herself hyper-aware of his presence, of the breadth of his shoulders against the pillows, of the strength in his hands even as he healed, of the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to her. Agnes noticed, of course. The older woman saw everything. "That man's falling for you," she said bluntly one morning as she and Sophia prepared breakfast. "And from the way you watch him, I'd say the feeling's mutual." Sophia felt heat flood her face. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't play coy with me, girl. I've got eyes." Agnes cracked eggs into a bowl with more force than necessary. "Question is, what are you going to do about it?" "Nothing," Sophia said firmly. "He's recovering from serious injuries. He's not thinking clearly. And I'm just the kitchen help who's caring for him because it's needed." "Hogwash." Agnes pointed a wooden spoon at her. "That man's been alone since his wife died in childbirth 3 years ago. And he's buried himself in work to avoid feeling anything. You're the first person I've seen him open up to since then. Don't throw that away because you're scared." Sophia's hand stilled on the potato she'd been peeling. His wife died. Baby too. Boy, Jonas nearly lost himself after that, threw himself into the business like a man possessed, working until he dropped, never letting anyone close. Agnes's voice softened. "But I see something different in him when he looks at you. Something alive again." The revelation shook Sophia. She'd seen Jonas's dedication to the camp, had attributed it to ambition or responsibility, but grief was a different matter entirely. Grief, she understood, the way it could hollow you out, make you afraid to care again for fear of more loss. That evening, when she brought Jonas his dinner, she found him sitting on the edge of the cot, testing his weight on his injured leg. "You shouldn't be up yet," she scolded, setting down the tray. "I'm going mad lying in this bed," he said, frustration evident in his voice. "The men need me out there. There are decisions to make, work to supervise. The work is getting done. Thomas is managing the cutting crews, and they hired someone from Centralia to finish the flume repairs." She moved to help him as he swayed slightly, her hands steadying his massive frame. Even injured and weakened, he was solid muscle under her touch, and she tried not to think about the way her pulse jumped at the contact. It's not the same. They're not doing it right. But he allowed her to help him back onto the cot, his frustration giving way to exhaustion. "Jonas," Sophia said carefully, remaining close, "why are you so afraid to let others help?" He was silent for a long moment, his jaw working. Finally, he said, "Because when you let others in, when you depend on them, they can leave, they can die, and you're left with nothing but the work." "Agnes told me about your wife," Sophia said softly. "I'm sorry." His face closed off, the walls going up. "That was years ago. But you're still carrying it." She sat beside him on the cot, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You're still punishing yourself by working until you drop, still keeping everyone at arm's length. You don't know what you're talking about." His voice was harsh, but she could hear the pain beneath it. "I know about loss. I know about being alone. I know about being so scared of hurting again that you wall yourself off from everything that might matter." She turned to face him and found his gray eyes already on her, raw and vulnerable in a way she'd never seen. "But that's not living, Jonas. That's just surviving." "What else is there?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophia reached up, her hand cupping his bearded cheek, feeling the warmth of his skin, the slight tremor that ran through him at her touch. "This connection. Letting someone see you, really see you, and choosing to stay anyway." Jonas's hand came up to cover hers, pressing it against his face. I don't want to lose anyone else. I can't go through that again. So you'd rather be alone forever? Never take the risk? Her thumb brushed across his cheekbone. That's not strength, Jonas. That's fear. Damn right I'm afraid. His other hand came up to cradle her face, his touch gentle despite his size. I'm terrified, because I've been falling for you since the first moment you turned around in that kitchen, and I don't know how to do this anymore. Don't know how to open my heart without thinking about all the ways it can break. Sophia's breath caught. You're falling for me? Like a tree under an axe. His thumb traced her lower lip. Completely, inevitably. Sophia, you walk into a room and everything gets brighter. You smile, and I remember what it feels like to want something beyond the next day's work. I think about the sound of your voice, the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating, the strength in your hands despite how delicate they look. I'm in so deep I can't see daylight. I think I'm falling too, she whispered, the admission both terrifying and liberating. I didn't mean to. I wasn't looking for this. But you're the first person in so long who's seen me as more than a burden or a disappointment, who's treated me like I matter. You do matter. His forehead touched hers, his breath warm against her lips. You matter so much, it scares me. Then be scared with me, Sophia said, her hands sliding up to frame his face. But don't push me away. Jonas answered by closing the distance between them, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was gentle despite his obvious hunger, restrained despite the emotion coursing between them. Sophia melted into him, her hands sliding into his dark hair as his arms came around her, careful of his injuries but strong nonetheless. The kiss deepened, growing from tentative to certain, a promise and a claiming all at once. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jonas rested his forehead against hers again. I want this. I want you. But I'm a mess, Sophia. I'm broken in ways I'm not sure can be fixed. You're not broken. You're hurt. There's a difference. She kissed him again, soft and sweet. And I'm not afraid of hurt. I'm only afraid of not trying. Over the following week, Jonas healed with surprising speed, driven perhaps by renewed purpose or simply by his stubborn nature. He began moving around the office, then venturing outside with a crutch Agnes had fashioned from a tree branch. His relationship with Sophia shifted from patient and caretaker to something openly acknowledged, and the camp took notice. The men seemed pleased if surprised. Jonas had been alone so long they'd given up hope of him finding happiness again, and seeing him smile, hearing him laugh at something Sophia said, watching him light up when she entered a room, made them all a bit gentler, a bit more hopeful about their own lives. Agnes was insufferably smug about the whole thing. Told you, she said to Sophia one morning, watching Jonas limp over to the kitchen window to say good morning before heading to supervise the sawmill. That man was just waiting for the right woman to remind him he was alive. He's remarkable, Sophia said softly, watching Jonas's broad back as he walked away. But he still pushes too hard. Then it's your job to remind him to rest. Agnes bumped her shoulder companionably. You're good for him, girl. I haven't seen him this settled in years. But trouble was brewing despite their happiness. The investors from Seattle arrived unannounced on a cold November morning. 3 stern-faced men in expensive suits who looked completely out of place among the rough timber workers. They demanded a meeting with Jonas, and their faces were not encouraging. Sophia was in the kitchen but could hear raised voices from the office. Agnes appeared at her elbow, her face grim. This is bad. They've come to assess whether Jonas is meeting their expectations. The meeting lasted 3 hours. When the investors finally left, their expressions were unreadable, and Jonas emerged looking exhausted and frustrated. He found Sophia in the kitchen and pulled her into a corner, his hands gripping her shoulders. They're giving me until Christmas, he said, his voice tight. If I don't meet the production quotas by then, they're replacing me with a manager from one of their other operations. I'll lose everything my father built. What can we do? Sophia asked immediately, her mind already racing. Jonas cupped her face, some of the tension leaving his expression. This isn't your problem, sweetheart. Anything that affects you is my problem now, she said firmly. We're together. That means we face things together. Something in Jonas's eyes softened, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She could hear his heartbeat, strong and steady, feel the way his breath stirred her hair. I don't deserve you, he murmured. Probably not, she teased gently and felt him huff a laugh. But you're stuck with me anyway. Now tell me what needs to happen. The answer was brutal. They needed to increase production by 40% to meet the quota, which meant longer hours, more men, more equipment, and pushing everyone to their limits. Jonas threw himself back into work with renewed intensity, his healing leg be damned, and Sophia watched with growing concern as he slipped back into old patterns of self-destruction. She tried to talk to him, to remind him that breaking himself wouldn't save the camp, but he was a man possessed, driven by the fear of failing his workers and losing his father's legacy. The warmth and openness that had developed between them began to freeze over as Jonas retreated into work, and Sophia felt helpless to stop it. Agnes noticed the change too. He's going to burn himself out, she said, watching Jonas limp past the kitchen at dawn, heading for the cutting crew. And when he does, he'll take your heart with him if you're not careful. What am I supposed to do? Sophia asked, frustration and fear mixing in her chest. He won't listen to reason. Then make him listen, Agnes said bluntly. You're not some timid mouse, Sophia Dawson. You survived being abandoned in a strange town with no money and no prospects. You've worked yourself half to death and put yourself back together. If anyone can stand up to that stubborn man, it's you. That evening, Sophia waited in Jonas's office until he returned, well after dark, mud-caked and exhausted. He stopped when he saw her, wariness in his eyes. You can't keep doing this, she said without preamble. I don't have a choice. He moved to the desk, shuffling through papers with hands that trembled from fatigue. Yes, you do. You're choosing to sacrifice yourself because you're too afraid to ask for help, too proud to admit you can't do everything alone. Sophia stood, planting herself between him and the desk. You're going to work yourself to death, and then what? How does that save the camp? How does that honor your father's memory? You don't understand, Jonas said, his voice rising. If I fail, 40 men lose their jobs, 40 families go hungry. This whole town depends on this camp, and I can't let them down. And what about me? Sophia shot back, her own fear and frustration boiling over. What about us? Do I just stand by and watch you destroy yourself? Do I get any say in this, or am I just supposed to accept that the man I love cares more about meeting some arbitrary deadline than about his own life? Jonas went still. You love me? Sophia froze, realizing what she'd said, but there was no taking it back, and she didn't want to. Yes. Yes, I love you, you stubborn, self-sacrificing fool. I love you so much it terrifies me. And I can't watch you do this to yourself. Jonas closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, ignoring his injured leg, and pulled her into his arms. Say it again. I love you, Sophia whispered against his chest, tears threatening. And I need you to take care of yourself, for me, if not for you. Jonas's arms tightened around her, and she felt him shaking. I don't know how to do anything halfway. I don't know how to not give everything I have. Then give everything to us, Sophia said, pulling back to look up at him. Give everything to building a life together, not just to work. Trust your men to do their jobs. Trust Thomas to supervise. Trust that you don't have to control every detail to be successful. I'm so afraid of losing this, Jonas admitted, his voice breaking. Of failing. Of proving I'm not half the man my father was. Your father would be proud of you, Sophia said fiercely, but he'd be heartbroken to see you working yourself to death. He'd want you to have a life, Jonas, to be happy, to love and be loved. Jonas cupped her face, his gray eyes searching hers. I do love you. I think I have since that first night when you held my hand while Agnes stitched me up. You looked at me like I was more than just the camp boss, like you saw the man underneath all the responsibility. I did see that man. I do see him. Sophia rose on her toes, kissing him with all the emotion churning inside her. And he's enough, more than enough. Even without the camp, even without living up to impossible standards, that man is everything I need. They stood together in the quiet office, holding each other as the weight of unspoken feelings settled into something real and solid. Finally, Jonas pulled back, smoothing her hair from her face. You're right. I've been drowning in fear, letting it control me instead of facing it. He took a deep breath. I'll talk to Thomas tomorrow, set up a proper management structure so I'm not trying to oversee everything personally, and I'll hire 3 more men from town to help with the production push. And you'll take Sundays off, Sophia added. Everyone needs a day to rest. A smile tugged at Jonas's lips, the first real one she'd seen in weeks. Are you going to spend every Sunday telling me what to do? Probably, Sophia admitted. Someone has to keep you in line. Jonas laughed, the sound warm and genuine, and pulled her close again. I love you, Sophia Dawson. You're the best thing that's happened to me in years, and I'm not going to lose you because I'm too stubborn to change. Good, Sophia said, snuggling into his embrace, because I'm not going anywhere. True to his word, Jonas began delegating more responsibility. Thomas proved more than capable of overseeing the cutting crews, and the new hires increased production without Jonas having to personally supervise every detail. He still worked hard, but he no longer pushed himself to the point of collapse, and he made time for Sophia every evening, even if it was just sitting together in the office, her head on his shoulder, talking about their days. The transformation in both of them was remarkable. Jonas smiled more, laughed more, the lines of constant worry smoothing from his face. And Sophia bloomed under Agnes's determined feeding and Jonas's affection. The sickly, too thin woman who'd arrived at camp barely 2 months ago had filled out, her cheeks now rosy with health, her eyes bright, her movements sure and strong. Agnes crowed with satisfaction every time she looked at her. Told you proper feeding would put some life back in you, the older woman said one morning, watching Sophia easily lift a pot of soup that she'd struggled with weeks before. You're glowing with health now, girl, and I'd wager it's not just the food. Sophia blushed, but couldn't deny it. Love agreed with her. Jonas's affection, his protection, the way he looked at her like she was something precious and miraculous, had healed something deep inside her that had nothing to do with food. For the first time since her parents died, she felt truly safe, truly valued, truly loved. December arrived with the first snowfall, and the camp worked frantically to meet the Christmas deadline. Production numbers climbed steadily, and cautious hope began to spread among the workers. They might actually make the quota. Jonas proposed on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year. He took Sophia walking through the snow-covered forest, to a clearing where they could see the stars brilliant overhead, and dropped to one knee despite his still healing leg. I know we haven't known each other long, he said, his breath misting in the cold air. But I also know I don't want to spend another day without you in my life. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever, the ability to hope, to dream, to want something beyond just surviving each day. Sophia Dawson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? The ring was simple, a gold band with a small sapphire that had belonged to his mother. Sophia looked at it, then at Jonas's face turned up to hers, his gray eyes full of love and hope and nervous anticipation, and felt her heart overflow. Yes, she said, tears streaming down her cheeks despite her smile. Yes, absolutely yes. Jonas surged to his feet and lifted her off the ground, spinning her around as she laughed and cried simultaneously. He kissed her with a passion that warmed her despite the winter cold, his strong arms holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. They returned to camp holding hands, and Agnes took one look at their faces and started crying herself, swatting at them with her apron, while declaring she'd known this would happen all along. The wedding took place on Christmas Eve, in the mess hall decorated with pine branches and candles. The entire camp attended, along with people from town who'd heard about the unlikely romance between the camp boss and the kitchen girl. Agnes outdid herself with the food, and even the stern investors who'd come to assess the final production numbers looked almost pleased as they witnessed the ceremony, because Jonas had done it. Against all odds, through delegation and hard work and proper management, the camp had met the quota with 3 days to spare. The investors grudgingly admitted satisfaction with his performance and agreed to extend their contract for another year with better terms. Jonas would keep his father's legacy, and the workers would keep their jobs. But standing at the front of the mess hall, holding Sophia's hands as they exchanged vows, Jonas knew none of it would have meant anything without her. She was his true success, his real fortune, the thing that made all the work and struggle worthwhile. I love you, he whispered, as the traveling preacher pronounced them married, my beautiful, strong, amazing wife. I love you, Sophia whispered back, radiant in a simple white dress that Agnes had altered from something of her own. My impossible, wonderful husband. They sealed their vows with a kiss that made the assembled loggers cheer and whistle, and Sophia laughed against Jonas's mouth, happier than she'd ever imagined possible. The years that followed were good ones. Jonas ran the logging operation with newfound confidence, balancing work with life in a way he'd never managed before. Sophia continued working in the kitchen for a time, until their first child came, a sturdy boy they named James after Jonas's father. 2 years later came a daughter, Sarah, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. Agnes declared herself an unofficial grandmother and spoiled both children outrageously. She lived to be 83, long enough to see James start learning the timber business, and Sarah become the terror of the camp with her fearless climbing and quick mind. Sophia thrived in her new life. The sickly, too-thin woman who'd stumbled off the stagecoach in Centralia was long gone, replaced by someone vibrant and strong, filled with joy and purpose. She worked alongside Jonas, managing the camp's accounts and worker relations, proving herself invaluable to the operation. The men who'd once stared at her skeletal frame now treated her with respect and affection, and the women who'd clucked their tongues that first day became friends, marveling at her transformation. "You're like a different person," one of them said years later, watching Sophia laugh as she chased little Sarah through the mercantile. "I remember thinking that day you arrived that you wouldn't last a week. You looked half dead." "I was half dead," Sophia admitted. "But I found someone who fed me until I glowed with health in more ways than one." Jonas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his strength still evident despite the gray threading his dark hair. "And you saved me right back. We rescued each other." It was true. They'd both been lost in their own ways, both starving for connection and hope and love. They'd found each other in a timber camp in the Washington mountains, and they'd built something beautiful together. The logging camp prospered under Jonas's steady leadership. He eventually bought out the Seattle investors and became the sole owner, running the operation according to his own principles of fair wages and safe working conditions. The town of Centralia grew alongside the camp's success, and the Jameson family became pillars of the community. When James was 12 and Sarah 10, they moved into a proper house Jonas built in Centralia, though they kept the camp and Jonas spent several days each week there, overseeing operations. The house was large and comfortable, filled with the sounds of children playing and Sophia singing as she worked, and Jonas never lost the sense of wonder that this was his life, this warmth and happiness that he'd thought lost forever. Sophia kept a photograph from those early days, taken by a traveling photographer who'd passed through camp. In it, she looked thin still, her frame barely recovered, standing beside Jonas's massive form, both of them staring at the camera with serious expressions. But if you looked closely, you could see their hands clasped between them, hidden in the folds of her skirt, the first physical evidence of the bond growing between them. She showed that photograph to her children years later, trying to explain where they had come from, how their parents had found each other. "You were so skinny, Mama," Sarah said, tracing the image with one finger. "Were you sick?" "I was hungry," Sophia said simply. "Hungry for food, but also for purpose, for someone to see me and think I was worth caring for. Your father gave me all of that." "Papa says you saved his life," James added, looking up at his mother with his father's gray eyes. "We saved each other," Sophia corrected, echoing Jonas's words from years before. "That's what love does. It sees the broken places and helps heal them. It feeds the starving parts until you're whole again." On their 20th anniversary, Jonas and Sophia returned to the logging camp, now managed by Thomas but still thriving. They walked through the familiar grounds, visiting the kitchen where they'd first truly connected, the office where Jonas had recovered from his injuries, the clearing where he'd proposed. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonas asked as they stood looking out over the valley, watching the sun set behind the mountains. "Giving up your plans to be a seamstress, ending up here instead?" Sophia turned to look at her husband, this man who'd taken a scared, starving woman and loved her back to life. His hair was grayer now, his face more lined, but he was still powerfully built, still protective, still looking at her like she was the most important thing in his world. "Regret marrying you? Regret building this life?" She shook her head, moving into his arms. "Jonas, that stagecoach breaking down in Centralia was the best thing that ever happened to me. Every moment since has been a gift. Even when I'm stubborn and work too hard, he teased, pulling her close. Even then, though I notice you're better about it now, she pointed out. I had a good teacher. He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. I love you, Sophia. More than the day I married you, more than I thought possible. You're still the best thing that ever happened to me. We're the best thing that happened to each other, Sophia corrected, standing on tiptoe to kiss him properly. And we have years more to be grateful for. They did have years more. Jonas lived to be 71, long enough to see both children married and to meet 5 grandchildren. He died peacefully in his sleep, lying beside Sophia in the house he'd built for her, and his last words were her name, spoken with all the love of their decades together. Sophia lived another 8 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, still strong despite her age. She told stories about the early days, about timber camps and mountain men, about being so thin people pitied her and so lost she'd thought there was no hope. She told how Jonas had fed her, not just with food, but with love and purpose and belonging, until she'd glowed with health and happiness. Your grandfather saved me, she'd tell the grandchildren gathered at her feet. But the truth is, I saved him too. We were both half dead when we found each other, both starving in our own ways, and we fed each other's souls until we were whole. When Sophia died, peacefully in her sleep like Jonas before her, they buried her beside him in the Centralia cemetery under a shared headstone that read, Jonas and Sophia Jameson. They saved each other. The logging camp still stands, run now by James's children, a 4th generation of Jamesons working the timber that Jonas started with. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the mist rolls down from the mountains, workers swear they can see 2 figures walking hand in hand through the camp, a massive man and a slender woman, both glowing with the health and happiness that love provided, still together even beyond death, still feeding each other's souls for all eternity. But that's all far in the future, from that Christmas Eve wedding, when Jonas and Sophia danced their first dance as husband and wife, surrounded by cheering loggers and the warmth of Agnes's kitchen. In that moment, they were simply 2 people who'd found each other against impossible odds, who'd been broken and lost and had somehow managed to heal each other. The women who'd clucked their tongues at Sophia's sickly appearance that first day were there at the wedding, marveling at the transformation. She stood beside her massive husband, no longer skeletal, but healthy and glowing, her eyes bright with joy, her smile radiant. She was a different person than the frightened woman who'd tumbled off the stagecoach, and everyone could see it. Who would have thought, one of the women whispered, that poor creature we saw that day, and look at her now, absolutely glowing. That's what love does, another replied, watching Jonas lift Sophia in his arms to carry her over the threshold of their small cabin, both of them laughing. When you find the right person, they feed your soul until you become more than you ever were alone. And in their cabin, as Jonas set Sophia gently on her feet and pulled her into his arms, they both knew it was true. They'd found each other in desperation, had healed each other through love, and had built something beautiful from their broken pieces. Thank you, Sophia whispered against his chest, for seeing me, for feeding me, for loving me back to life. Thank you, Jonas replied, his voice rough with emotion, for doing the same for me. You saved my life, Sophia. You gave me a reason to live beyond just survival. They held each other as snow began to fall outside, the first real snow of winter, blanketing the camp in white. Inside their cabin, warmth and love kept the cold at bay, and 2 hearts that had been starving found nourishment in each other, beginning a life together that would span decades and inspire generations. The story of the mountain man and the sickly woman he fed until she glowed with health became legend in Centralia, told and retold until it took on the quality of fairy tale. But for Jonas and Sophia, it was simply their truth, the foundation of a love that transformed them both, that proved 2 broken people could become whole together, that demonstrated how love, like proper nourishment, could restore health and happiness to even the most desperate soul. And when the snow melted that spring, revealing the green valleys and towering mountains of Washington Territory, Jonas and Sophia stood together on their porch, Sophia already beginning to show with their first child, both of them healthy and strong and glowing with a happiness neither had thought possible months before. "We made it," Sophia said softly, leaning against her husband's solid strength. "We did," Jonas agreed, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "And we're only just beginning." The future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility, built on a foundation of love and mutual salvation, of feeding each other's souls until both glowed with the kind of health that went far deeper than physical appearance. They'd found each other in the wilderness, two lost souls desperate for connection, and they'd built something that would last for generations, a love story for the ages, proof that sometimes the most broken people can save each other, if only they're brave enough to try.